Hello everybody! In this video I'm going to try and show how to checkmate with a bishop and knight, and king, against a lone enemy king. Now this is much harder than it first appears. 3 pieces against 1, it should be easy, right? Well, there are some masters, grandmasters, international masters, who can't actually do it. They don't know how to, and this endgame doesn't appear very much, but it's still useful to know how to checkmate. So it's white to move here, and white is going to try and force the enemy king into a corner. Now what's important is that white has a dark squared bishop, and the only way to checkmate the enemy king is to force him into a corner which is the same color as the bishop. So the black king needs to be forced to a1 or h8. So white first plays knight e6, king f3, knight d4 check. Now what white is doing here is putting the knight on a fairly central square to control more of the board. And what's important is that you need to control both coloured squares. So the bishop is controlling the dark squares, the knight needs to control the light squares, and for the white knight to control the light squares, it needs to be on a dark square. And the reason this checkmate is so difficult is sometimes the bishop and the knight trip over each other a little. So black here has 2 options. One is to run into the corner not on the same colour as the bishop, which we'll cover a bit later. But firstly, supposing the king doesn't run to the corner or the edge, supposing he stays near the centre with king e3. Well, it's tricky, but you can force him to the edge of the board. It just takes a little bit of prodding. Bishop g3, so you're forming a net, stopping the king moving to the f file. It now has to move back to the d file. Bishop f4, so again you're tightening the net a little bit. The king has to go to c3. So we're slowly actually forcing the king closer and closer to the corner where we can checkmate him. Bishop e3, so just using a move to maneuver. The king doesn't want to go anywhere. Bishop f2 now, so again the black king has to move back. Let's reroute the knight a little. So the reason we've rerouted the knight to go away from the centre is that it now controls the d3 square as well as the e2 square. And that will stop the king being able to move back between c3 and d3. King back c3, and now bishop e1 check. So here the king has to give ground a little and allow white's king to get closer to him. King c2, king c4. If king b3, then king d4 would be played, and black couldn't escape because king a4, king c4, and black couldn't run to a5 due to the bishop on e1. So we're containing the king in the quarter of the board. So supposing you divide the board in half twice, there's a little square going a1, a4, d4, d1, that sort of 4x4 square. So king d1, bishop c3, and now he has to move back because the knight on f4 is guarding e2, king c2, and now reroute the knight again. So if the king goes to the corner, it will be very easy. But supposing he tries to get as far away as he can, king d1, bring the king in with king d3, king c1, knight e3, so we're cutting off his retreat to back to d1, king b1, and the knight's also controlling c2. So we can reroute the king now to b3. So if king c1, king b3, so instead king a2 to stop the white king advancing, but we can play king b4, king b1, king b3. So now the king is very close to the corner. We just need to keep prodding him. King c1, and now just waste a move. Don't move the knight or the king, they're perfect. Bishop e1. King has to move back, and now bishop d2. So the king can only oscillate between a1 and b1. So now all we need to do is, what would you do after king a1? Yeah, very good. The bishop is perfect. It's controlling c1. The white king is perfect. It's stopping the king moving away. So we just reroute the knight. Knight c2 or knight c4. King b1. Now take away b1. Knight a3 check. King a1. Bishop c3 checkmate. Okay, so we can force the king to the edge in the corner if the black king stays near the center. We just have to reroute our knight and bishop a little. Going back, so we had this position. In the original line we looked at, king e3 and bishop g3 were played, so shepherding the king over towards the queenside corner. But supposing the king runs to the bad corner, the one where we can't really checkmate him. Well, let's see what happens. Okay, so the king's not going anywhere, he's just going to stay in the corner. So again here, either a1 or h8, it doesn't matter which, as long as it's a dark squared corner square. So we need to drive the king there, and this is the position you need. You need the king on f3, so 2 squares diagonally away from the corner square. Now we reroute the knight either to g3 or f2. So here we're going to make it f2 because the black king is on f1, so it's closer to the knight. So now what we want is knight f2 stops the king running into the corner. That's why f2 or g3 is correct for the knight. And now when the king goes into opposition with our king onto f1, we now cut off the retreat with bishop h2. So here's our starting position. Now, we just need to force the king, it's not too bad, only 5 squares to the left. How hard can that be? King e1. And here we zigzag with our knight. We want to have our knight on f2, d2, and b2, possibly, controlling the light squares. So knight e4 to reroute it. If king to f1, we have a very easy time with knight d2 check, king e1, and then king e3. So supposing the king makes a break for it, he's going to try and run all the way to a8. King d1. Now shuffle the king along so we can play knight d2. And again, yeah, if king e1, knight d2 here, and the king can't run back to h1, he has to come back to d1. And then we can play either bishop g3 or king d3. And then if king to e1, bishop g3 check, and the king slowly getting shepherded. But again, we're looking at the more difficult line where he runs up. King c2, knight d2 again, zigzagging. King c3, so he's almost escaped, but bishop d6. That takes away b4. And now the king has to go back to the second rank. And I would play bishop b4 possibly, but bishop e5 is also good, forcing the king back to the first rank. Bring our king along, shuffle him along. King d1, and just stop the king running back to h1. So bishop g3, king c1. Again, zigzag the knight, so it's coming to b2 to cut off the d1 square. Knight b2 check, king c1, king c3. So now the king is, again, he's back on b1 now. So king b3, just cut off the black king from running to a2 and making life hard. King c1, bishop f4 check. And again, the king and bishop are perfect. They are preventing the black king from going anywhere other than a1 or b1. So we just need to reroute the knight to take away b1 from the king. Knight c4, king a1. Now here, I find that a lot of players go wrong because what they do is they play king a3, or even worse, knight a3, stalemate. So what you want to do is just waste a move. So the move I do is bishop g5. Bishop doesn't matter where the bishop is on that diagonal, as long as it's controlling c1. So now king b1 and knight a3 check, not stalemate, but check. King a1, bishop f6, checkmate. So again, I hope you've taken something from this video. Remember, the knight and bishop can trip over each other a little bit, but you need the knight on the same coloured square as your bishop, because the knight controls the squares, the different coloured squares to the square it's currently occupying. You can force the king, but you need to force it to the corner square of the same colour as your bishop. And remember, if the king's in the opposite corner, you need to set up this position. So here you have the king 2 squares diagonally away from the corner square, the bad corner square. So the king's on f3. You need a knight on a square that is controlling the corner, so f2 or g3. Here it's f2. And then when the king is forced, you need the bishop also controlling the other dark square, so the king can't just go g1, h2, g1, h2 forever. And now when the king stands in front of the knight and your king, bishop preventing king moving back, and then we just zigzag our knight and use the knight and bishop to cut down the king's options until it is all the way in the corner. So I hope you got something from this video. Comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.